Okay.
Is recorded. So people, we record this so that it goes on to the dashboard. Everything is private on the dashboard, and we do this to protect people's questions and make sure that they feel comfortable. But as long as I can have a thumbs up of people that yes, we're good to record. If you're not good to record, I've got to ask you to leave. We do have one slight change from our original 3 speakers. We're down to 2 today because Desiree had a death in the family. So I assure you she will be back, because I even was going to introduce one of her trials that she is actively recruiting for this population. So she will come back, and you know, I wish her our thoughts and prayers in her time. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started and ask everyone to mute themselves. And if not, I will mute you as you come in. And I'm going to just briefly introduce our 2 guests. Ladies, if I can get you to raise your hands. I have Colleen and Rashida. And I'll start.
Man, I really need to figure out how I get to this goal.
There we go. I got you muted. I have Rashida. I'm going to have you start first and do a brief introduction and let everybody know where you come from.
Yeah, so Lynn, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with everyone today. I'm actually based right outside of Nashville, Tennessee, and I get really excited when I get a chance to talk about my part in clinical research. So a little background about me. I've been in research for about 15 years and in the clinical research industry for 10 of those years. I've been in several different roles within the industry, from the site side and interacting with patients to what I'm doing now as a senior clinical research associate. And in that role, I essentially go to research sites to ensure patient safety and review the quality of data that's produced from clinical research.
Awesome, thank you. And our other esteemed speaker, Colleen. Colleen and I met about 1.5 years ago. She presented at a conference, and it was just an immediate connection. And I'll let Colleen take it away, but she has a ton of information about clinical trial research as well. Colleen?
Yeah, hi. Yep. Hi, Lynn. Hi, everybody. Colleen Graham. I have been doing this shockingly almost 25 years, which is always scary. Every year the number goes up. I suppose it beats the alternative. That's what I remind myself. I actually started at a site and then became a CRA, Rashida, and probably still one of my favorite jobs was traveling around to all of US and Canada and meeting all of the sites and doctors who were running the studies. I have been at pharmaceutical companies and big and small, and kind of really always been in the operations realm, which means I work with all of the scientists to operationalize or execute and make sure that the studies are happening and that everybody knows how to conduct them. So that's always kind of been my remit, is the operations piece.
Thank you. I am going to also let everybody know that while these ladies are not necessarily right now in the clinical trial space for brain injuries, they both have experiences personally in the brain injury space. And I'll let them share that if they're comfortable with you, but so they understand our challenges that this community faces as well. So we try to hold questions to the end, but if somebody has a burning question and you need to get it out, feel free and we'll take a pause. So before we get started, there's one thing that I also want to let everybody know, is that there's a great quote that I found, and it's from Malcolm X, and it says, he said, we can't teach what we don't know. And I find that very applicable, but I wanted to change it a little bit to what we're doing here today, which is to start teaching you about clinical trials. And that is, we can't do if we don't learn. So I applaud all of you for coming here today, because until you start learning and understanding about how challenging a clinical trial is, not just for the companies, but the doctors, but the people who are doing the one-on-one research with the patients, and most importantly, the patients, right? So if you don't know, you're not going to be able to be fully participating all the way through. And that's where we're starting. We're starting so that you have a base and you have a knowledge that you can start asking questions and feel very, very informed. So with that, I'm going to let the ladies start by telling us what's the favorite thing that they do first thing in the morning, because they're going to be human just like us. Colleen?
Well, in reality, my morning is usually started off by a puppy or a child having some sort of a need. So, but if I were to have my druthers, I would love to be able to, I look forward to the day when I can wake up on my own and get out of bed of my own volition. So that would be my favorite thing. I don't currently experience it, but that will someday be my favorite thing.
And
Oh my
Rashida,
gosh,
what's
that's a good
yours?
one.
Okay. Same.
So yeah, I too have two small school age kids, and so when I wake up because of my alarm. Otherwise, I would sleep all the way in if I could. But when my alarm goes off, I try to stay in bed awake just for a little bit to just kind of process, okay, this is what I have to do for the day. Let me not just hop up and start getting in mommy mode. So I just kind of do breathing exercises, which is something new to me. And then I kind of just get out of bed and start the day.
There you go. Nice. All right, Rashida, let's keep going. You have worked your way up, not all the way to the senior level where Colleen is, but what first got you into clinical trials? And I know you come from a degree in public health, but what got you interested?
So I originally wanted to go to medical school. And so when I went to college, biology was my degree. I was also introduced to research in the lab there. So we provided a lot of cell culturing and testing some of the cells for different toxicities. And I also helped validate some of the testing procedures that we were doing. And it really wasn't until I started my coursework in my master's program, so master's in public health, where human subjects research was something that actually started to interest me more. I just thought about medicine as people being treated for the symptoms that they had at the moment, and not let's take another approach and see what else is out there and how we can possibly improve upon the health. And so that's kind of what got me going, was my master's program. And I kind of worked throughout the site level and interacted with patients there. And, I worked in phase 1 oncology when I was a coordinator, which is a tough indication to be a part of when you interact with the patients and their families, and you see how many different drugs that they've been a part of, and just the quality of life that they've had outside of clinical research. And just talking to them, you, along with the physicians, you're giving them a chance to have a quality of life that they may not have had prior to being in clinical research. And I think a lot of them had a sense of, I want to do this not just for myself, but for other people who are going to come after me. And so that's what really drove me to continue in clinical research. And then outside of what I do in my 9 to 5, I'm also very passionate about representation of different ethnic groups in all levels of clinical research. So that's from the patient volunteer side to the physician and site staff, and then throughout the corporate business side of clinical research. I think, representation is important, and it also provides a different perspective, which in turn produces more quality and life-changing healthcare for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to come back to the patient questions in just a second, because I want to drill down a little bit more. But Colleen, I know that you were doing a similar role, but what I'd like you to talk about is since you have a much longer, me too, 20 plus years. I decided to stop saying 25 and go 20, because everybody knows,
20 plus.
Yeah, 20 plus.
20
but
plus.
Tell me the trends you have seen, right? Because you started as a monitor, you started as a CRA. So people, we're going to make sure that you all understand these terms, because this is part of the confusion that can happen in clinical trials. But tell us the trends that you have seen, the good, the bad, the ugly.
It's funny, when I started and when I was a CRA, Rashida, I remember, I traveled all over, and now that role, they tend to kind of say, okay, you're going to travel to a particular region and not make you travel everywhere. I was living in New York City at the time at a really small company, so they were sending me everywhere. So I was flying all over the place all the time to go out and visit the doctor's offices and review the work that they were doing and making sure they were following our our protocols, which is the document that we write. I'm going to assume no terms are known here, right? So the
Right.
document that we write that specifies every single step and every single criteria and everything that needs to happen in a uniform way, we go out and make sure those things are happening. They also have to be in compliance with the FDA, right? The federal drug. And in the US, we follow FDA guidelines and rules. And I would remember striking up conversations with people on planes, as you often do. And people would say, what do you do? And I'd say, I do pharmaceutical research. And they'd go, oh, they'd think I was one of two things. They'd picture me with a lab coat and test tubes and think that I was some sort of science genius, which I'm not. Or they would think that I'm in marketing and sales. And then they'd say, oh, can you get me any good, samples of anything? And I'd say, nope, that's not what I do either. I'm kind of right in the middle between the scientists who make the drug and the marketers who then, commercialize that and sell that off. And over the course of history and time, and actually even, 2020, I'm alluding to a question you might ask later, right? But
Okay.
what's happening now is people are starting to understand. Like when I say I am in pharmaceutical research, people have heard the term clinical trials, even if they don't know the nuances and they don't know the details of what it takes to get a drug to market. They know that there's this thing called clinical trials, and they never did before. And so that's pretty cool that when I start to talk about what I do, that there's growing awareness of this whole line of work.
Right. And that's perfect, right? I mean, the one nice thing about COVID, it has put clinical trials on the map for us all, right? So, and everybody knows my career was there as well. And as a biostatistician and epidemiologist, most people would say to me, oh, is that a skin doctor? I have this mark. I'm like, yeah, okay, no. So let's take it. All right. So now, Rashida, I'm coming back to you. Let's take it to when you actually involved yourself with the patients. What did you say? What did you hear? And how did you address their fears?
So there's always how it's typically set up, their physician is the one who presents the clinical trial or the research to the patient. And typically they're the ones who really get in the nitty gritty and the medical part about their disease or, whatever is under study. And so my part was always coming in behind the physician to see if there were any questions, because I think some people get a little intimidated when they talk to their physician and maybe they're a little nervous about, asking questions. I mean, even as a patient, I sometimes feel nervous about asking my physician to clarify something that they've told me, even though I'm just like, this is my healthcare, right? I should be feeling empowered to say, well, that doesn't really make sense to me, or I heard this, and all those things ran through my head as a patient. And those are some of the same questions that I would get from patients. And the one thing for my patients were, how have other people been impacted by this, right? And I always have to go to the section of the informed consent that says, based on the research that we've seen, these are some of the symptoms that you may have, or these are some of the adverse, events, or I'm trying to find another term, but these are some of the things that could happen that aren't good products of the research and the drug that we have. But, informed consents are there to fully inform the patient about what they're getting themselves into. And so really answering questions and being honest to say, I don't have the answer for you. Let me write that down. Let's bring the physician back in after we go through all of your questions to see if she or he can provide more insight for you. So just really getting people comfortable with the empowerment of asking questions and feeling comfortable to do that was something that was very challenging to me. And that's how I approached it.
Awesome. So I can tell you I believe in that process too. And I often would go through things with patients if they didn't have any questions, because the probability was they were afraid, right? And we had a policy in our oncology work that we actually sent people home and made them wait 24 hours because we knew they had to come back anyway, but we did not want them to be hurried into consenting to agree to a trial. And so I think this is now going to go to Colleen, because of the trends is that companies are desperate to find patients that want to get into the study, but stay in the study, right? And so a lot of information in recent papers and publications is that patients think, one, they're going to get the drug as opposed to a placebo. And so I'm going to let Colleen speak to this topic. Placebos being a sugar pill, a fake drug. It's not a drug, right? And so patients want to now demand it, which you really can't do because that violates all sorts of statistical processes that have to stay intact. So Colleen, you and I have had a long conversation a couple of times, I believe, over what advocacy groups are telling patients. And when you get them, right, because you were working on a really cool rare disorder for pregnant women. So let me also put it out there. To conduct a study with pregnant women is unbelievable because they're so highly protected, as our children, as our veterans, as our prisoners, so for a whole bunch of reasons. But her challenges were just incredible. So can you speak to a little bit about those challenges that you had?
Yeah, I'm not sure where to start there. So I think there's one point that I want to highlight is that, this whole informed consent, it's a technical process that every patient goes through. And there is a document physically that you read, agree to and sign off on. So there's a physical document that they'll call an informed consent document. But the whole idea of it is that it's a process. And I think this is where you guys are going into, right? That it has to be a conversation. There has to be questions. The informed part of it is really critical. And I think it's intimidating a lot of the times to understand all of the options. With the pregnancy indication that I was working in, I've been doing this for a while. I said more than a minute. And whenever you were running studies, everybody had, if you were going to agree to be in the study, one of the key things that you had to agree to was to not practice abstinence or, safe sex, and, agree try not to become pregnant or have your partner, your partner should not become pregnant while you're in the study. And if that happened, that was considered a serious event, and that everybody needed to know about it right away. And then they want to follow what happens to see what the effects potentially are on an unborn child, or, once they are born. So if you heard the word pregnancy in a clinical trial, it was like fear-inducing, because you were like, oh no, this is not what we wanted to have happen. So to be working in an indication where we're looking to actually treat anemia in pregnant women and their fetus, we were actually trying to treat the fetus. It was to educate this population. So a little bit about the disease. Technically, you're treating the fetus, and so women who had this issue in prior pregnancies would know, if I have another baby, I'm at risk, for this happening again. So they would often have had very severe traumatic experiences with pregnancies and would just decide, I'm not going to do it anymore. So trying to get the word out there to say, just so you know, there's this new focus. There's this group of people who are looking to try to create a treatment, to create a cure. They're looking into this. They want to, help you. These women were not pregnant, so we didn't want to incentivize them to get pregnant because there was no guarantee they could get into the study, that they would benefit from it. And so there was this, but then we wanted to also talk with them to understand, to hear their stories, to understand what we always call as the patient journey. Like what was it like to get diagnosed, and then treatment and all of the follow-up. So to understand that experience, but then also try to be impartial and not put undue pressure or influence on them. It was a really challenging conversation to navigate, because if you didn't know where we were coming from, and that we're heavily regulated and we have to be very careful about what we say for good reason, there was a perception on the other side of, these patient advocacy groups that we were lawyering up, right? That we were, closing, not being forthcoming. But it wasn't that we were trying to hide anything. We were just really trying to tread lightly and not put any sort of undue influence or make any undue promises that we couldn't fulfill. So I think that's a lot of what we've talked about, Lynn. So
Yeah.
hopefully I answered your question.
You did. But basically what Colleen just said was advocacy groups are there to help support individuals, whether it's a brain injury or pregnancy issues or, a broken leg, whatever the area is, it doesn't matter, because there's this high level overarching policy and regulations that we must follow when clinical trials are conducted. And when Colleen was referring to regulatory statutes, that is for the FDA. So because every single piece of paper that is given to a patient, it must be approved, right? And so we have a hierarchy of approval processes. So an institution has an approval process. They have to get theirs approved by the next organization, which is usually the sponsor. And then it has to be approved by an IRB, and then it has to be approved by the FDA. So that's when Colleen is referring to these heavy regulations. We are not allowed to just cut to the chase. We can't just say it as it really is, right? So advocacy groups do have a tendency to blur these lines, and it becomes very, very tricky, and patients get angry. And when patients get angry, what happens? They quit. Mm-hmm. So I would like both of you to address, what does it mean when somebody, and we're doing like the high level overview here, everybody, because we have clinical trial modules to help, teach you about this, but what happens when somebody quits, right? That's a problem. So Colleen, I'll let you go ahead and go first on this one.
Meaning they've
withdrawn from
consented.
The study.
Okay, yeah. So they, once somebody comes in, they say, "Yep, I want to be in the study. I'm signing this document. I'm going to follow the protocol. That I'm going to follow the whatever the study has designed for me to do." If you leave the study, and this is definitely Lynn's forte, the stats, they design this. There's mathematics behind how they have designed a study, that we need a certain number of patients to reach certain time points in the study, and to fill out, anytime there's a questionnaire, or if you have a visit and they're taking your vitals and they want to know your blood pressure, there's a reason behind every single procedure and every single activity that you do while in a study. So if at any point you stop, it interrupts the overall analysis and review and assessment of that study. And there's usually some level of accounting for some people dropping out for one reason or another. But if too many people do that, then your study runs the risk of not being able to be proved, for lack of a better word, to have an answer as to whether you met the goals that you set out for yourself.
Yeah, it is a big problem. All right, Rashida, what happens when somebody quits?
So many alarms are rung when a patient quits. It's from my standpoint, outside of the direct patient care, everyone wants to know, well, what happened? What's the situation surrounding the patient wanting to quit? Was there, they always ask, is there some kind of adverse event that happened that wasn't reported and nobody knew about it? Because those things are really important to patient safety, right? And so if there's something that happened to the patient health-wise that hasn't been reported, we need to know about that so that we can make sure that the physicians are able to follow that through. And if a patient needs to go see a specialist about something to help them follow up that process, then that is extremely important. So that's the number one thing. We want to make sure that our patients are very safe when they're in the trial. The second piece of that is what Colleen was saying is the producibility of the study, meaning the quality of work, meaning every data point that is collected for a study. I don't think people realize this, but when you are looking at a bottle of Tylenol, right, and you turn it and you see the directions and you see those effects that you may have, those are all based on the data that they've used, the science behind patients participating and following through with all of the procedures that are stated in the protocol, and being followed up even after they stop taking some of these drugs to see, well, what are the long-term effects on this? And so when patients, decide to quit, which is their complete right to do that, right? So like, this is all a volunteer thing. That's another part of the informed consent process, right? Sites and physicians have to make sure that patients are aware if they're not wanting to continue, they have every right to say, I don't want to do this. But also the physician side should make sure that the patient's health is being followed correctly, even if it's outside of the study. And then I think that's it.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to impress that I like people to consider it as a job, right? Because people doing the research are really depending upon people who want to be a volunteer, but you are a volunteer and you do get to quit. So have people ever said, and I know we're coming up on the half hour, before I ask my next question, does anyone have a question that you would like to ask? The group has been very polite today. So a lot of times they'll be like, hey, wait, I have a question. Does anybody have a question before we continue?
I have a quick one, and just knowing myself, I'm a stroke survivor, and knowing the population that we're in, how do you define informed consent? At what point do you realize that the person signing this piece of paper isn't truly grasping what informed consent means? And
I just had a mild heart attack thinking that happens. No, but it does, I'm sure. I think 100%, if there is the single most important thing that we do in any part of this process, and there is enormous gravity around that informed consent process. And I emphasize each of those words because there's a lot of history that came into that document and that process coming to be. So I would say there's a large amount of training that we do up front, and reiterating and talking over and making sure that it's clear with everybody at the site. So the doctor, any staff that they have who would be administering and really walking people through this informed consent, that it is a process that we walk you through what it is, every single thing at every single visit, the amount of time that it could take you. Like, you should have no surprises. And if that process is done properly up front, right, then it limits people dropping out later or having kind of buyer's remorse, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. So the emphasis and importance and the review and checking that happens appropriately is critical to just about everybody and every company I've ever been at. I hope that answers your question, but yeah.
Also to that, physicians have, an obligation to make sure that their patients understand what they're getting into. And I think depending on the type of, so like if you're a stroke victim, right, there are certain things that may not make sense at that time. And so physicians, just being a physician, period, you mm-hmm. have to have the best interest of the patient at hand. And I think they understand what it looks like for people to fully understand what they're doing. And it's not a one-sided thing. It's an interaction between the patient and the site staff and the physician to ask those questions. And if you're asking certain questions, then obviously that may mean that you don't fully understand what's going on. So let's not sign this right now. Let's wait, let's process it. Let's think about it. Let's do some more digging and figuring that out.
There's another thing to add here, Kelly, to your point. When Natalie, my daughter, as you all know, when she was initially injured and I was looking for a trial for her, right? I wanted to get her into something because there was nothing out there to help her. At one of the conferences I had presented at, I was having discussions with another presenter, and I was quickly learning that there was no way my daughter with her brain injury could give an informed consent. Mm-hmm. She could present right then and there, perfect, and she could say, yes, I agree, I'm over 18, yes. And I assure you, for years, she could walk out of that room and have no recollection that what she just agreed to. And so she would not show up. So if it was on her own, she would never show up, and she would then be what we call lost to follow up. And so to me, people in this spectrum, and we actually did it with chemo patients because of the brain fog that occurs, we always required a caregiver to be present throughout the consent process. And we needed to rely upon them. And so, I think you've also heard me say before, we have our Take Two initiatives. It takes two people to navigate through a brain injury, regardless of the kind of brain injury. So, so that's where a burden then becomes now brought into another person, right? And I had a big panel down at a Scope conference about how do caregivers involve themselves and what is their role in clinical trials, which is starting to also really become a topic in the forefront. So maybe the ladies can speak to that as well.
Go ahead, Rashida.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, you have to have a partner in all of this. And when I was a coordinator, if someone had a spouse or, a close family member or a friend, I always recommended that they got some kind of outside opinion, because when you're in that position, you are somewhat vulnerable because you really need the help, right? You're coming because there's something going on and you need another option outside of what you're already doing. And when you're able to talk about that to someone outside of that, that's when questions start coming, right? And it's like, oh, well, I didn't think about that. Let me write this down and ask. So I used to ask my patients to write down all the questions. If they talk to a family member, write down their questions so that when they came back, maybe come back with that family member or someone else that you trust, that can help you outside of what you're doing right now. So yeah, it definitely takes more than the person, I think, involved in clinical research to try and get that insight and so that they can feel that empowerment to ask those questions if they're not clear.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think the other part that I've seen in terms of the caregivers is with many diseases and many situations, it's not just about the patient, right? It's about, a number of years ago, I was working in hemophilia, we were working mainly in kids, but that is a disease that isn't just about the patient, it's about the family, and it affects everybody. So part of what you're trying to do is ease the burden on the family, not just ease symptoms or whatnot for patients. So I think that there's a huge focus, especially in certain disease states, where the caregivers are just as much a part of this journey as the patients are.
Yeah, you couldn't have said that any better. So it is 3:34. Ladies, I don't know if you need to leave and get to any meetings or whatnot. We can continue this for a few more minutes. I wanted to ask one final question, if it was okay. And then if the audience has any questions, please, do a shout out. What's your one piece of advice? What's the take-home message? One sentence to just let people kind of simmer about clinical trials. It has to be clinical trials related.
I would say talk to people around you to remove the mystery of the process of clinical trials.
I like
mine's
that.
probably pretty similar, which is get involved and ask questions, and play a role, whether it's with your doctor or anywhere else, but get involved and ask questions and push boundaries.
Oh, I love that one. I love that one. So two things that I want to illuminate. Taylor is on, and Taylor's one of my interns, and she has been authoring an entire series of clinical trial modules that we are putting out there for free. And I remember when I first told Colleen what we were doing, she was like, Taylor, she was blown away. I'm like, nope, we have to teach them at their level. We have to make sure people, right, push boundaries and ask these questions, right? Those are great pieces of information. The other thing that I also wanted to echo was that to make sure you wait, being informed, and that to me is the holy grail of clinical trial research. To truly feel informed that you have answered all these questions, and it is okay to take a moment to think about it and come back. All right, so Ladies, that's really all I have for you. Folks, does anybody have any more questions?
Don't be shy.
I know. Wow. You guys are really quiet this time.
Was it
Well, I
completely
just want to
overwhelming?
say, Lynn, again, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this. You know, I do have a personal story where my mom had a stroke a few years ago. And because of that, she is now paralyzed on her right side, which is her dominant side. And, you know, the after effects of her stroke, she hasn't recovered to her normal baseline. She has a new baseline now, and ever so often she gets triggered and she has a seizure disorder. So that in turn, you know, brings her back to this, you know, level of when she first had the stroke, and she has to have that physical therapy, the occupational therapy, all of those things have to happen to get her back to her new baseline. And I think the work that you're doing is so powerful. You know, it's needed, right? Like these are conversations that we need to have with more people. And then just outside of work, I try to talk to my family members about clinical research just as an option, because it does drive innovation in healthcare. And I think, you know, more people are starting to be aware of it, which is a great thing. And I just think that we just need to outwardly talk about it more. So thank you.
You're welcome. I have one question, and it is from our friend in Canada. If you are Canadian, can you be in a US-based clinical trial? And the answer is sometimes. It's not always an absolute yes. It depends upon, one, if the sponsor of the study is going to pay for you to travel, unless you have the money and the means to travel down. But sometimes there's restrictions of like a 50-mile radius. It really does not matter where you are from. So I would encourage you to investigate that a little bit more. Colleen, were you going to say something?
No, they're clinicaltrials.gov.
Yep.
If people don't know that website, it's not the most exciting website to be on or the super easiest to navigate, but you can search as the majority of studies from like once you start to study it in humans on, you have to post there if you're running the trial in the US, and they'll post where else they're running it. And you can look there to see for any different type of indication, and you can filter it to what you're looking for. It's a helpful website if you haven't gone yet.
Yeah, and one of our aspirations is, as we start teaching and encouraging people about clinical trials, is that we will be bringing clinical trials to them. So the more you have information and you get on board onto the dashboard, we will be filtering all this information for you. I think the one last thing to let everybody know is COVID has, I think, implanted a little bit of maybe different expectations than what the reality is for clinical trials. Trials do not start and stop in 9 months, right? In the old days, when Colleen and I first started, it was maybe 3 years. But now they're longer, right? They're 6 to 7 years because of a lot of problems that are occurring within clinical trials. But what you're seeing in the news, et cetera, it is not the norm. So make sure that you also are very aware of that too. But again, TBI trials and stroke trials are starting to really emerge. So I would definitely want to make sure anybody who has questions, please send it to me. I also will forward questions to the ladies. Like I said, Desiree has a trial that she is actually recruiting for. It's a disability study, so wide open. You know, a lot of people have disabilities. Is there anything else? Let me double check another question that came in. Go ahead and do a shout out. You are welcome, Pam. All right.
So I'll give last thoughts if that's okay. I mean,
yep.
Similar to what Rashida said, I know she had to drop off, but I'm so thrilled to have been here today. I love what I do. I'm incredibly passionate about what I do, and I think there's a whole missed group of us in the pharmaceutical world who, you know, are motivated by good things and altruism and wanting to make the world a better place. And you know, we like making a difference. And so it's nice to kind of have forums where, you know, there's always the other side of things that you know, maybe catches a news filter, but there's so much more to it. And I just love any chance to talk with people who are interested in what we do. So, Lynn, I love it. I love everything about what you're working on. And I'm just so thankful to be here today. So if there's questions afterwards, Lynn knows how to find me. And
Yep.
I don't mind at all.
Yeah. All right. Well, last chance, everybody. I'm going to let Colleen go. This will be recorded. And again, this is just the first of many as we are going to start bringing clinical trial sponsors forward to you so you can talk to them, and we'll be releasing our modules very soon. I encourage you, get on the dashboard. It's going to be the way that we reshape clinical trials, and it's all about learning, right? What was the quote that I started with today? If we can't do, we don't learn. All right. And with that, I'm going to thank everybody for attending. I will email you when this is on the website. All right. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.